So we're going to be doing a shir in siman kuf tzadik vav in Hilchos Niddah. The seder of the shiurim is we first learned the Torah and the Beis Yosef, going through the Gemaras with all of the Rishonim, followed by the Shulchan Aruch and all of the Neisa Kelim, followed by the later Achreinim, which deal with today's shilas that came up in the past few hundred years, all the way until the Achreinim of today that deal with the shilas of today's day and age. So as we mentioned, we're starting siman kuf tzadik vav in Hilchos Niddah. This is the dinim of the Shiva Nikkim. Now, before we start actually the learning, we have to give a hagdama, an introduction, that we know that the Torah gives us three separate mitzvahs. There's the mitzvah of Niddah, and there's a mitzvah of a Zava. And in the Zava itself, there's a Zava G'dela and there's a Zava Ktana. So in order to understand what we're going to be learning, we first have to preface and explain what is the difference between a Niddah, Mid'Oraisa, a Zava G'dela, and a Zava Ktana, and what we do today. So this is discussed at length in the beginning of Hilchos Niddah in Siman Kuf Pei Gimel, where the Torah and the Beis Yosef give us a whole background from the Gemara all the way down with all the Rishonim of how we keep the laws today, the dinim today, and how the process worked, how we got to that stage. The Torah tells us when it comes to a Niddah, a lady who sees within the first 7 days of an 18-day cycle, she becomes what is called a Niddah. What is a Niddah? The Torah says one has to wait Shivah siyamim tiya b'nidasa, that she's going to be a Niddah for a full 7 days. She performs a Hefsek Tahara. It's machlekes. We're going to see when that Hefsek Tahara must be performed, and then she tevels on the 7th night. So obviously that's not what's done today. Today we count something called the Shiva Neki'im. That we're going to explain in just a second. However, min haTorah on a biblical level, a person who is a Niddah does not need to count the Shiva Nikkim. Rather, she can be bleeding literally for the entire 7 days, as long as a Hefsek Tahara is performed. She may tevel on the 7th night. So the 7th day passes, and that night she may tevel, and that is the din of a Niddah Mid'Oraisa. Then we have another category. We have something called a Zava. After the first 7 days of Niddah, how this exactly is calculated, these cheshbonos of 7, when it starts and all that, that's discussed as well at length in Siman Kuf Pei Gimel. There's a big machlekes in the Rishonim between the Rambam and the Rif and other Rishonim. But after the Torah was kiveh these 7 days, begins another time period of 11 days. These 11 days, if any blood is seen in them, a person would become a Zava. And the Torah refers to this time as B'loi Eis Nidasa. It is not the time of her Niddah. So therefore, if she sees any blood during this time, she has a new status called a Zava. And in the Zava itself, there are two different dinim. There is the din of a Zava Ktana and a Zava G'dela. What's the difference between a Zava Ktana and a Zava G'dela? A Zava Ktana is somebody who sees for 1 day, they perform the Hefsek Tahara, they stop the bleeding, then they wait the entire next day, and they tevel that day. They only keep 1 day. It's called Shemeres Yom Keneged Yom. She saw blood for 1 day, she keeps 1 day and tevels the next day. The same thing would be if she sees blood for 2 days. She's still considered a Zava Ktana, so she sees blood for day 1 and day 2. She keeps the 3rd day, make sure it's clean, and she tevels that day. Now, the Torah gave a special mitzvah of a Zava G'dela. A Zava G'dela is if she saw blood for 3 days, during the days where it's possible to become a Zava, as we mentioned, the 11 days which come after Yemei Nidasa. And if one sees for 3 days during those days, during this 11-day time period, then there's something called the Zava G'dela, and the halacha is that they must keep something called the Shiva Nikkim. Shiva Nikkim means one must perform the Hefsek Tahara, and then the following day, they begin counting the Shiva Nikkim. Now, we're going to see in Mitzvah Hashem today that there are many dinim connected to the Shiva Nikkim. There are dinim of what follows up to it. There are dinim of how many bedikot one must perform. There are dinim of what one has to wear during the Shiva Nikkim. Now, the reason why we gave this Haggadama, that we gave this introduction, is because today's day and age is very, very clear in many places in the Shulchan Aruch and in all the Rishonim, and the Torah, and the Beis Yosef, that today everyone has a halachic status as a Zava Gedela, no matter what. If one sees blood for 1 day, one sees blood for 2 days, it doesn't matter what time during the cycle it is, or some even find just a stain. They didn't even have a full flow, or they found blood in the bedikot. They have automatically the status of a Zava Gedela, and today everyone must keep the Shiva Nikkim. Now, with this introduction, we'll start the tour. We'll see the discussions that are connected to these halachos. We will discuss the Rishonim a little bit outside, and the Gemaras, and then in Mitzvah Shem, we're going to see how it plays out in the Shulchan Aruch itself, all the different shittas, so on and so forth. So the Torah starts off in Siman Kuf Tzadik Vav, that Shivas Yamim Shazal V'Seferes Mescheles Mimachras Yem Shepaska Bay. As we mentioned, a Zava Gedela, and today everyone is a Zava Gedela, must count to the Shiva Nikkim, the 7 days. So the Torah right away tells us, when do these 7 days begin? They begin the next day after she performed a Hefsek Tahara. So she performed the Hefsek Tahara. Then the following day do the Shiva Nikkim begin. The Kach Mishpata, and this is the halacha of a lady who is a Zava, Im Tira Shnei Yamim Shleisha. If you see 2 days, 3 days, as we mentioned in the Hagdava, if one sees for 2 days during the 11 days where she could become a Zava, she does not become a Zava Gedela yet, and she does not have to count the Shiva Nikkim. But over here, very clearly, we see, if she sees only for 2 days, she still has to count the Shiva Nikkim, and obviously for 3 days, that for sure you have to count the Shiva Nikkim. Some of the Rishonim actually point out, what's the diuk? Why does the Torah bring 2 days or 3 days? So firstly, according to the Pashto Pshat, that there's no difference. Any blood which is seen, even if it's just 2 days, you would have to count the Shiva Nikkim. That's the simple understanding. Some want to add and explain that the diuk of 2 days is because there's still a possibility to become a Zava Gedela with 2 days, and that is if you see 1 day, and you see the next full day, and it extends into Bein HaShmashos. Therefore, it's very possible that even though the Re'iyah technically is only 2 days, it did not fully go into the next day, but since Bein HaShmashos may actually be part of the next day, so there is a so there is a possibility when one can become a Zava Gedela just with a Re'iyah of 2 days. So again, V'kach Mishpata, this is the halacha of one, if one sees Im Tira Shnei Yamim Shleisha, or 2 or 3 days, Upaska Lires Bedekes Atzma B'yim Shepaska Kadesh Tifsek Matahara. So the halacha is, it's not enough and just not to see any blood. Oh, you're wearing a garment which is close to the body and you see the entire day that it's clean. Oh, it must be that the bleeding stopped. The halacha is not like that. The halacha is one must actually perform a bedikot in order that this bedikot creates a chazaka that she stopped the bleeding. And then the following day, the Shiva Nikkim, that the following day can start being counted as the clean days. Now, it's very, very important to point out, the Beis Yosef brings from the Rosh and Perek Tinekis that today's day and age, the halacha is even afal pi sheirgisha shepasko dameha ha'la'olam hi b'cheskas tuma ad shetivdik v'timtza tahira. This is a very important foundation that the Rosh gives us, that even if one feels that the bleeding has already stopped, not only that, it's already been a few days. Firstly, they're not feeling any blood coming out. They felt that it stopped. Not only that, I may even have a proof for it. V'haraya, a few days passed and there's no blood. The Rosh writes very, very clearly, nevertheless, she's still b'chaskas tuma, she still remains in the original chazaka that she's bleeding, that she's tmeya, ad shetivdek v'timtza tahira, until she actually performs the bedikot and she finds herself to actually be clean. That is the only way that one can begin counting the Shiva Nikkim from the next day. So just to summarize 2 points, that number 1, a Hefsek Tahara is required before the beginning of the Shiva Nikkim. So one performs a Hefsek Tahara, and the following day, the Shiva Nikkim begin. Number 2, it's very important to also point out that what is the definition of a Hefsek Tahara? it means that it must be an actual bedikot. Without a bedikot, it is not worth anything. It's as if she's bleeding the entire time, because the Torah says she has cheskos tumah until she performs a bedikot to prove otherwise. Then the Torah continues, V'kosa v'rashba, Badka atzma shacharis amatza tahira, afal pishle badka ben hashmoshes harezu b'cheskos tahira. The Rashba tells us, the Torah brings from the Rashba, that the one who performs a bedikah in the morning, even though they did not perform another bedikah towards the evening, close to Ben Hashmoshes, and we're going to see, the Beis Yosef is going to explain what is their cutoff point. That we're going to see in Mitzvah Hashem soon. So the halacha is, she's still B'chazkas Tahara, the Hefsek Tahara still counts. However, what happens if she only saw blood for one day? She did not see anything more than that. Blood was only seen for one day, and she performed the Hefsek Tahara on the same day. The question is, does it help? Can one even perform a bedikah in the morning or not? So, the Torah continues and he says, again, so the first opinion that the Rashba brings is it still works, it's still okay. However, the Torah continues, most Rishonim actually learn like the second way. What is the second way? The second way is that we know on the first day, how does the flow begin? There's psichos hamayon, the uterus opens up and there's bleeding happening the entire day. So most Rishonim want to learn that a Hefsek Tahara on day one does not help. Why is, if it's done in the morning, a bedikah shacharis on day one does not help. Why is that? Because hoyel umayana pasuach. What does it mean, hoyel umayana pasuach? That means that even though I may have performed the Hefsek Tahara now, but it's not going to help me, since the mayon, which is referring to the rechem, which is the uterus, is open the entire day. So just because I made a bedikah, it's not a complete birur, it's not a complete chazaka that she stopped bleeding, because since it's still open, she may continue to bleed throughout the day. And what is the reasoning of the Rishonim, which is the Rashba? He's the only one that holds that it does help bedikah shacharis on day one. What is their reasoning? Because the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yossi asked Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon. There's a discussion, there's a diyun, the Gemara has a whole back and forth about when you can make a Hefsek Tahara. There's three shittas in the Mishnah. And then the Gemara tells us a story of Rabbi who went and he asked Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, what is the halacha if a lady made a bedikah on the 7th day from her bleeding in the morning, and she did not make a bedikah later on in the day closer to the shkia? What's the halacha? So they told him, Tahira, sharezu b'chazkas tahara. It actually does help. Then he continued, what's the halacha of shishi on the 6th day of the bleeding? Chamishi, Revi'i, Shlishi, Sheni, Mahu. What will be the halacha if she performed the bedikah in the morning these days? So Amru Li, Rabbi says that these Chachamim answered me and they said, B'chazkas tahira. It still counts. The bedikah performed in the morning from day 2 to day 7 still does count as a kosher Hefsek Tahara. However, V'rishay le'sha'alti. The Gemara continues and tells us that he did not ask about day 1. And then Rabbi says something very interesting. V'ta'isi shaloi sha'alti. It's a mistake that I didn't ask them. What's the reasoning to say that it's a mistake that he did not ask Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon? Is day 7, day 6, day 5, day 4, day 3, and day 2, are they not standing in cheskas tumah? V'kiven the pasak. Since you performed the Hefsek Tahara and you proved that the bleeding has stopped, pasak, we have a chazaka that the attack has stopped. So he says, Rishay Nami, the first day would be the same thing. Kiven the pasak. we would have the same chazaka if it comes on day 1. We would assume the same thing, that pasak, and actually one may begin to count the Shiva Nikkim from the next day. Then the Gemara continues and asks a very interesting question. We know why he regretted not asking his question. But what was he thinking in the beginning? What was his hava mean? What was it going through his mind that he did not ask originally? So the Gemara answers, this is what we mentioned earlier, that since on the day 1, it's huchsak, there's a chazaka, that the uterus is open, the rechem is open, therefore, just because I made a bedikot in the morning is not strong enough to prove that there's stimas hamayon, that the uterus actually indeed closed up and is no longer bleeding. So this is one of the main discussions of when a Hefsek Tahara helps. Let's go now to the Shulchan Aruch to see there's much more in the Torah and the Beis Yosef. There's long discussions in the Achreinim, in the Sidrei Tahara, in the Chavas Das, which are the later Paiskim, which are brought in the back of the Shulchan Aruch. There's very, very long discussions, different ways how to learn the Sugya in the Rishonim, so on and so forth. Let's have a look how we paskin in the Shulchan Aruch, how we approach the Shaila Lahalacha. So, the Mechaber in the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Kuf Tzadik Vav begins as follows. Shiva Siyamim Shazava Seiferes. The 7 days, the Shiva Nikkim, that is Zava, must count Maschilin Mimachar Siyam Shapaskabay. They begin the following day, the next day, after she performs a Hefsek Tahara. So again, as we saw from the Beis Yosef, who brought from the Rosh, when it says Mimachar Siyam Shapaskabay, that Pascha, what does it mean Pascha? It doesn't mean she just stopped the bleeding. Pascha, the definition is that she performed a Hefsek Tahara. Now, the Mechaber continues. How does that work? This is the halacha. And she stopped bleeding. She makes a bedikot, as we just mentioned, and this comes from the Rosh. She makes a bedikot on the day that she stops bleeding. Then the Mechaber adds, at what time during the day should this bedikot be performed? The Mechaber tells us that it should be done samuch levein hashmashos. It should be close to, literally, the shkia, and after shkia begins the bein hashmashos. Now, the Beis Yosef actually, in the Torah and the Beis Yosef tells us, what is the definition of bein hashmashos? It's very difficult to understand, because on one hand, if you're going to tell me bein hashmashos mamish, literally bein hashmashos, that's bein hashmashos is a safek yom, safek laila. When you reach the time frame of bein hashmashos, it's very possible that it's still the same day. Well, there's a safek, maybe it's already part of the next day. But the halacha is, like we saw very clearly, that the Shiva Nikkim only begin the next day after you finish performing a Hefsek Tahara. So therefore, if you want to learn that bein hashmashos means the bein hashmashos mamish, you have a problem, because maybe it's already part of the next day. And if it's part of the next day, you definitely cannot count it towards the Shiva Nikkim. So therefore, the Beis Yosef explains that bein hashmashos over here means before the shkia. Because after you hit shkia, that is already considered as a safek laila, and safek laila would mean that it's the following day. Interestingly enough, the Beis Yosef also points out very, very clearly that from what time can you perform this bedikot? Right, we're going to see right now, as we saw in the Torah, if somebody performs, the Torah brought from the Rashba, somebody performs a bedikot in the morning, it actually does help for the Hefsek Tahara. The whole discussion of when it does not help for the morning is only if it's performed on day 1 of the Shiva, the day 1 of the bleeding. So over here, the Mechaber brings very straight, only samuch levein hashmashos. What is the definition of samuch levein hashmashos? So the Beis Yosef tells us that this time is defined by from mincha ktana until before the shkia. So from mincha ktana, one can perform the Hefsek Tahara, and that's still considered l'chantchila, all the way up until the shkia. Obviously, from shkia on is already bein hashmashos, so it has to be a little bit before the shkia. Now, the Beis Yosef himself does point out that the bedikot should be as close to the shkia as possible, However, for mincha ktana is no longer considered a bedikah shachris. It's no longer considered a bedikah in the morning. So there's actually a very big nafkamina lahalacha from this Beis Yosef. If one wants to perform the bedikah of the Hefsek Tahara lechatchila, Shiva lechatchila, so to speak, we'll see there's more. There's a meichtachok, so on and so forth. But at least in the way of lechatchila, but however, if it's going to be around the time of Shkia, let's say they're traveling, let's say they're giving a shir, they're learning the bechamrusa, whatever it is, they're not able to perform the Hefsek Tahara at that point, then one can actually be magdim, they can perform the Hefsek Tahara even earlier. They can do it from mincha ktana and it's still considered lechatchila. Now, the Ramah continues and he says as follows, this is definitely the lechatchila way of doing it, ubediyavid, if one went ahead and they did it even before this time, even if they did it in the morning, as we saw in the tour, sagi bakach. The halacha is, it still counts as a Hefsek Tahara and is still valid. Very interestingly, if you look in the Shach in the Sivkot and Beis, the Shach writes very clearly, when does the Hefsek Tahara in the morning help you? The Shach says, Hainu miyim sheni miriyasa ve'elach kilakamans if Beis. It's only going to help you from day 2 and on from when the bleeding began. Like we're going to see in Seif Beis. Then the Mechaber continues and he says as follows, this is what the Ramah adds, Lahachmir l'chatchila, b'teich bensei shetehei beidakis b'yem Hefsek Taharasa b'meich dafuk, u'sheyehei sham kol ben hashmasher shezu abedika meitzia midei kol safik. On top of just a bedikah, there's a hider mitzvah, as the Ramah points out, Lahachmir l'chatchila, this is the l'chatchila way, Shiva l'chatchila, of performing the mitzvah, is it's not enough just to perform a bedikah for the Hefsek Tahara, rather one should also insert a meichdachuk, and this meichdachuk should stay in the entire bein hashmashos, meaning from Shkia until Tzeis. And what does this bedikah accomplish? What does this meichdachuk accomplish? It accomplishes that it takes out from any suffix of maybe there was dam or not. So again, according to halacha, if one performed the Hefsek Tahara without the meichdachuk, it's still kosher, it's still valid. However, the mitzvah and the mumchar, the best way to perform the mitzvah is to leave in the meichdachuk, the entire bein hashmashos. Okay. Here's a very interesting question. How do we view the times of the day? We just mentioned bein hashmashos means that it has to be before the Shkia. How about, what's the halacha if somebody's makabel Shabbos upon themselves early? Does that make any difference? So technically, for me, it's already the next day. Does that change anything in my count? Let's say I wanted to perform the Hefsek Tahara today, but I was already makabel Shabbos. So technically, it's already the next day for me. Does that take away my ability to perform the Hefsek Tahara or not? So this is what the Ramah addresses. The Ramah says, Yesh Eimrim im Yispalalu HaKol Arvis. If the Tzibur already davened Ma'ariv, so it's not necessarily when it comes to Shabbos, it can be any night. V'Eid Hayim Gadol, and it's still daytime. So according to this Yesh Eimrim, they would say, Eina Yechela Livdek Oz Lilish Ranim Ulahaschol Limnes Miyem Machnas. Why? Why cannot one may not begin the Shem Neki'im? Me'achad HaKahal Kvar Osu Eisei Laila. Since the Tzibur already pronounced, so to speak, they made the day into night, therefore they may no longer perform the Hefsek Tahara because technically it's already considered night for you. V'yesh Eimrim, the Ramah brings another shita, the mutter afilu ha'osa kol Shabbos. The other shita which the Ramah brings is one actually may still perform the Hefsek Tahara as long as it's day and then did not actually hit the Shkia, even if the congregation, the Tzibur, the Kohol, even accepted upon themselves Shabbos. So the Ramah tells us, l'chatchila, we are careful about this, and b'diavad, if it happened after the fact, ein lochosh, one does not have to be careful about this. So this is all for Seif Aleph. So just a quick summary, that today everyone has a din of a Zava G'dayla, and therefore, no matter what, they have to count the Shiv Nikkim. Now, we're not going to be learning this inside. This is later on in the siman, in the chapter. There is a halacha that one must wait 5 days to perform the Hefsek Tahara for a different reason. The reason is because of Peilatas Shichvas Zera. That Chazal were geyser that in order to start the Shiv Nikkim, one must always count 5 days in advance because of the halacha of Peilatas Shichvas Zera. That's later on in the siman and Seif Yud Aleph. For now, we're just discussing the Ikare Hadinim of how the Shiva Nikkim begins. Let's say you already counted the 5 days, the Dinim of the Hefsek Tahara, so on and so forth. This is Neki'im because we're going to see a Shach in Sivkot Nong where it plays out an Afkamina L'maisa. Let's continue to see if Beis in the Shulchan Aruch in the Mechaber. So, Siv Aleph, we were dealing with, she's making a Hefsek Tahara, she's performing Hefsek Tahara on day 2 or day 3. And we mentioned there's a chumrah of day 1 that a meichdachuk or a bedikot shachris does not work afilu b'diavad. According to some shittas, according to the Rashba, we saw that a bedikot shachris actually does help b'diavad. However, we're going to see how we actually paskin, because we saw the shach in Sivkat Beis and Siv Aleph that says that a bedikot shachris its mashma would not help. Okay, so Siv Beis, the Mechaber starts as follows: Rasa yem echad bilvad, one saw blood on one day, upaska by yom, and she stopped bleeding that day. The halacha is tzricha livdek atzma b'meichdachuk u'sheyehei sham kol bein hashmashes. Wow. In Seif Aleph, what do we see? A bedikot shachris is even good. You should do l'chatchila samach lebein hashmashes as close as to the shkia that you could. And it's proper. It is the best way to do the mitzvah is with a meichdachuk. That's all from day 2 and on. What does the Mechaber tell us if somebody is making a Hefsek Tahara on the day itself that they stopped the bleeding? They started and they're stopping by yom. It's only 1 day of bleeding. The Mechaber clearly paskins that one must perform a meichdachuk, and it has to be there the entire bein hashmoshes. So from Seif Aleph, a meichdachuk is the best way to do the mitzvah, and that's the way the mitzvah should be performed. However, it is not ma'akev. Seif Beis, the Mechaber tells us there's only one option: you must perform the meichdachuk. According to Shittas HaMechaber, the Ramah adds, if she performed a bedikot, which was just close to bein hashmoshes, umotza atzma tahara, afal pishlei haya hameich etzla kol bein hashmoshes sagi, aval bedikot shachris loy mahani, hoyel v'leirasa rak yom echad. The Ramah takes a different approach when it comes to this din. The Ramah does not agree with the Mechaber that a meichdachuk is ma'akev on Yom Aleph, on day 1 of the bleeding. However, the Ramah does agree that a bedikot shachris does not count if it was performed on day 1 of the bleeding. However, la halacha, the Ramah says, if one performed a bedikot samuch lebein hashmoshes, this does actually indeed count for a Hefsek Tahara. So we have a machlokes. According to the Mechaber, one must have a meichdachuk, the entire bein hashmoshes, if they want to perform a Hefsek Tahara on day 1 of the bleeding. And according to the Ramah, it's not required mamash meichdachuk. The only thing that does not work is a bedikot shachris. What's the difference between a bedikot shachris and a bedikot samuch lebein hashmoshes? So, as we mentioned earlier, the Beis Yosef gave us a shir of mincha ktana. And the Pischei Shivah indeed brings from the double Revava that the same thing over here is as follows. So the Ramah told us, if one performed the bedikot shachris, it does not help for a Hefsek Tahara. So the Shivah, ayin bedaglam revava. Look in the daglam revava. The daglam revava was the Niddah b'Yehuda. He wrote the Shabbos and Shivah's Niddah b'Yehuda, and he has a pirush on the Shulchan Aruch, the daglam revava. So Shekasav, the daglam revava, wrote the lav davka bedikot shachris. It's lav davka. When it says bedikot shachris, it's lav davka. It's not just a morning bedikot, which is not good. Ella kol sha'isa kaidem in chaktana Allahi ma'ani b'yem arishin ein sham. So anything which is before mincha ktana lagabi, this is considered a bedikah of a bedikot shachris, and it does not count as a Hefsek Tahara for the Shiva Nikkim. In order to begin the Shiva Nikkim, if one is making a Hefsek Tahara on day one of the bleeding. So according to the Ramah, if somebody wants to perform a Hefsek Tahara on day one of the bleeding, it must be from Mincha Ktana and on. Before that, the Daglam Revava clearly writes that this would be considered a bedikot shachris, and it does not count as a Hefsek Tahara in order to count the Shiva Nikkim. So practically what that means is, we saw on the tour that the Rashba holds that one may perform a Hefsek Tahara in the morning b'yom harishain, and then the tour brought that the Rashba brings v'yesh machmirin, and the halacha is actually like the yesh machmirin, that the Rev Rishonim actually do hold like this, that it does not help. Now, let's think about a very simple question. L'mai nafka mina. As we just mentioned, today's day and age, one must always wait 5 days before making the Hefsek Tahara. One makes the Hefsek Tahara on day 5, and only after that can begin the count. So, can we ever have a case that one is performing a Hefsek Tahara on day 1 of the bleeding? You have to wait 5 days anyways. What practical implication do we have from this seif? So we have the Shach in Sivkat and Vav, who actually brings this shaila from the Madani Melech. And he says as follows: V'kosu b'sefer Madani Melech Dav Shin Amud Aleph V'zel L'Sheinei. This is the lotion of the Madani Melech. According to what we do today, that you have to wait 5 days anyways, like we're going to see later on, Seif Yud Aleph. L'may nafkamina, day 1, day 2, day 3, there's no such thing, it's always day 5. Hafilu isha shirloya kasam noigin shetzich l'amtin chamisha yamim im yem shenasabay v'achar kach tifsek v'tisbashem Nikkim. Come on, Seif Yud Aleph. Even if somebody only sees a kesem, and by definition they can technically make a Hefsek Tahara on the same day, nevertheless the halacha is they must count 5 days. So l'may nafkamina, why are we learning Seif Beis? What practical implication does it have? L'halacha l'maisa. And he answers very gishmak. He says as follows: V'nirali denafkamina lahecha dechazra v'rasa b'teich yimei hasfira. The nafkamina is when she restarted bleeding during the Shiva Nikkim themselves. The kivin shalei rasa rak yem echad b'mei hasfira b'dikot shachris loy mahani afilu b'diavad. Ava loy rasa rak kasem avshel lahakal b'mei bein b'mei hasfira bein b'tchila adkan. The Shach brings that there is a nafkamina l'maisa when it comes to this din. What's the nafkamina lahalacha l'maisa? The nafkamina lahalacha l'maisa is if somebody began counting the Shiva Nikkim, meaning to say they already counted the 5 days, they waited the 5 days that they were required to in order to set aside to get not to be worried for Pilata Shechvazara. Again, the details of what that means, how it works, the Truvasadashin, all of the background behind it, that's in Seif Yud Aleph. But once somebody already took care of that chashash, and they began counting, and the student was niskalkal, she saw again a re'iyah, or she had an unclean bedikot, so she needs to perform a new Hefsek Tahara. That's where the nafkamina l'maisa comes in, where a bedikot shachris, according to the Ramah, is not going to help you, and according to the Mechaber, one would actually require a meichtachuk, afilu b'diavad. So again, let's just bring this in a very practical way, in a very practical oifen. Somebody received the period on Monday. So Monday passed, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. They performed the Hefsek Tahara halacha on Friday. They started counting. They performed the Hefsek on Friday, so Shabbos is day 1, Sunday is day 2, Monday is day 3. Monday, the bedikot came out with blood. Or they started bleeding actively again. Then, this is where this Shivah plays in, that if this happened to a person, let's say it happened at 8 a.m., performing a bedikot at 10 a.m., 12 p.m., 1 p.m. is not going to help you. Rather, in order for the Hefsek Tahara to count, it must be performed after Mincha Ktana, in order to count as a Hefsek Tahara. And according to the Mechaber, one must perform not just the Hefsek Tahara, but they also must have a bedikot the entire Bein Hashmashis. Now, with that being said, I'm going to mention that there's a big discussion in the Gedolei HaAchreinim, as we mentioned earlier. There's a Sidrei Tahara, there's a Chavas Das, and they introduce a new chumrah of Yom Shirasa. If there's dam on that day, if she was bleeding that day, then one would either, according to one opinion, would actually need afilu amechdachuk b'diavad, and according to the other opinion, they just need a bedikot from a mincha ktana and above. Again, what does that mean? It's based off of a taisvis in Maseches Niddah, that if one saw blood on that day, but it's not the first day of her beginning to bleed. Let's say she started bleeding, she continued into day 2, day 3, day 4, now she wants to make her Hefsek Tahara on day 5, for example. However, let's say on day 5 she was still bleeding. According to these Achreinim, this day is much more chomer than any other day, because it's a day that she was actively bleeding on. And since it's a day that she was actively bleeding on, therefore, they would require either, according to one shitta, you would have to go with a mechaber, you would mamash require a mechdachuk, or according to the other shitta, you would need a bedikot min mincha ktana, from mincha ktana and on, up until the shkia, any time between this time frame. And anything before that, afilu b'diavad, according to them, would not be considered a Hefsek Tahara. Now, the Piskei Dinim Tzemach Tzedek actually does bring this shita. Halacha l'maisa, obviously, this shir is not intended for halacha l'maisa, and one must obviously ask their own pesach how to proceed in their case. But however, these are the shittas which are brought down. Many do not accept the chumrah because you don't find it anywhere else. And the emissaries, if you look in the Ramban, from the Ramban is l'chayra mashma clearly not like that. But al kopanim, this is the shitta, 2 shittas in the Gedolei HaAchreinim, which is brought down by the Piskei Dinim, which was written by the Talmud, one of the Chassidim. It's called the Piskei Dinim Tzemach Tzedek, but not all the Piskei Dinim are from the Tzemach Tzedek. Rather, it's from Reb Nachum Ayaleib, the Vitebsker. So many of his ksavim got mixed in with the Tzemach Tzedek, so sometimes it was printed together. So this halacha grad is not from the Tzemach Tzedek himself, rather it comes from the Vitebsker. And let's learn the last seif for today. Seif Gimel goes as follows. Until now, we were discussing the Hefsek Tahara to begin counting the Shiva Nikkim. Now we're discussing what comes immediately after. Is there any prerequisite to count the Shiva Nikkim as signs for the bedikot itself? So the Mechaber writes as follows: B'yom shepaska me'lireis, on the day that she stops seeing ubeidakes atzma ka'omer, as we mentioned, that she performs the Hefsek Tahara, when, and obviously the mechdachuk lechatchila, and sometimes that's even ma'akev afilu b'diavad. The halacha is tilbash chaluk habadukla she'ein by kasem. One must wear a garment that does not have any red on it. Kasem meaning it shouldn't have any stains. Ubalayla tasim sadinim habdukim iksamim. She should place on her bed different covers that do not have any ksamim. Ubayim hamacharas, and the next day tatzchil lisper Shiva Nikkim, and then from the next day becomes day 1 of the Shiva Nikkim. Zog the Ramah says, "Mina kosher hu." It is a proper minuk k'sheha isha peisakis b'tahara shetirchatz. She should wash herself, ulevashes ulevanim, and she should wear white. So it's very interesting. When the Mechaber brings that she should wear a garment that does not have niksamim on it, any stains on it, does that mean that it can be colored? He doesn't mention white. Only the Ramah says it's a mina kosher shetirchatz ulevashes levanim, and she wears white garments. So we have the Knei Beisim from Harav Brandsdorfer Zatzal, from the Gedolei Poskim Eretz Yisrael, from the biggest mumchim in Hilchos Niddah, from his son already took him over. The Baal Knei Beisim, he teaches as follows in the Mechaber and the Ramah. He learns that the Mechaber is not telling you you're allowed to wear colored. Rather, according to the Mechaber, as long as there's no kasem, it can be dirty. It doesn't have to be spotless. As long as there's no ksamim, that's enough. And according to the Ramah, he's going to learn that Ramah means levanim means cleaned, mechubasim. Everyone agrees you must wear white. However, the Ramah is coming to be meisif that you must wear not just white, but rather the levanim means mechubasim. They're actually washed. And not only is there no kasem on it, but there's no other dirt, there are no other stains on them as well. Amnam, the Ramah continues, the first mina kosher that the Ramah brought down was rechitza. One should wash themselves before performing the Hefsek Tahara. Now the Chachmas Adam points out, what does it mean, what's the halacha of rechitza? It does not mean taking a shower, taking a bath. Rather, it means rechitza in the thighs. Anywhere where blood could be, that's where one must wash. However, the Ramah continues, if one did not do that, and she only washed panaha shalmata, the halacha is dai bekach. And this, according to the halacha, is enough. Now, what happens? What's halacha if b'diavad one did not wash at all? So the Ramah brings out, if she only washed panaha shalmata, that's enough. What would be the halacha if one did not do any rechitza to begin with? They just didn't do it. So we have the Teres HaShlamim. The Teres HaShlamim is the Baal Minchas Yaakov, which the Alter Rebbe quotes many times in Hilchos Niddah, and in Hilchos Pesach, which now, when the recording is taking place, we're in Chedesh Nisan. He was also the Mechaber of the Chok Yaakov on Hilchos Pesach. He was a Meferish on Hilchos Pesach. The Alter Rebbe also as well brings him many times. And he has a Chibur he wrote on Hilchos Niddah, the Teres HaShlamim. And it's interesting to point out, any time the Alter Rebbe refers in Hilchos Niddah to the Teres HaShlamim, he does not call him by the name of Teres HaShlamim, rather he calls him by Minchas Yaakov. So whenever you learn the Alter Rebbe and you see Minchas Yaakov, it's actually referring to the Teres HaShlamim. So he points out, b'diavad, if she counted the Shiva Nikkim without rechitza, calls man, she didn't find a kesem, it's fine, it's okay, it's not a problem. And another reason, so that's the halacha of b'diavad. Let's just think about it, let's just explore what is the reasoning behind this minhag. Why does one have to wash themselves to begin with? Right? A minhag is not just out of nowhere, rather there's always something behind the minhag. So we have a machlekes between the Teres HaShlamim and the Sidrei Tahara. According to the Teres HaShlamim, as we just mentioned, the reason is, in case there's any leftover blood before the Hefsek Tahara, if you're going to come to find it on your garments later on, there's a halacha that one may not be teila ksamim within the first 3 days of the Shiva Nikkim. That's later on, Sifyud, exactly when you could be teila, when you can be teila. There's a big machlekes. The Ramah, the Shach, the Taz takes a middle ground. But Akoponim, what's going to be, if one actually still has blood on them, and they're going to find it on their garment because they didn't wash themselves out, then it's going to come and hurt them, not hurt physically, but it's going to come to affect them. They're going to have to restart their count based on blood which happened even before the Hefsek Tahara, because the halacha is any blood found within the first 3 days, it's not so simple that you can be teila b'maka. And therefore, one would have to be matamet l'chumra, and it doesn't even help. Another we take the same svara and we turn it the other way. The Hefsek Tahara explains very differently. He says that, one second, if you're not going to wash, what are you going to do? You're going to be tailor within the first 3 days on the dam from not washing yourself. And that we're not going to allow you to do. Therefore, that's why one must wash themselves. So according to the Hefsek Tahara, comes out l'chumra. We're not going to allow you to be tailor. That's why you should wash yourself out. Okay, with that, we will end today's share.